A video game is, in essence, the greatest form of entertainment. While I certainly enjoy film and literature, neither of those particularly capture the interactive element of video games. Of course, there have been attempts to do so, particularly in the late 20th century with the divergent narratives of interactive films and choose-your-own-adventure books, but in my opinion, neither of these match the value of a video game in terms of gameplay.
I don't believe what I just saw. Those bloodsuckers just got Lisa, and you had a chance to save her. I put the lives of those girls in your hands, and you screwed up.
One of the great things about video games is the broad spectrum of experiences into which a video game can fall. Video games can be narrative experiences, arcade-style games, puzzles, shooters, and many more. However, this naturally leads to many theoretical problems with regards to categorization and the identity of video games. For example, one common focus of video game studies is the dialogue surrounding how video games should be studied in terms of the core approach that theory should take. One such approach is narratology. This is the idea that video games should be studied as narratives, very much in the same way that we've come to study films or books. On the other side of the coin lies ludology, which is the idea that video games should instead be studied by how they are played, through aspects like design and player choice. These two frameworks are commonly presented in opposition with each other, with ludologists oftentimes asserting that narrative and gameplay cannot exist within the same space, and therefore narratology is an ultimately futile exercise. Markku Eskelinen, an editor for game studies, famously wrote in the journal's first issue, "If I throw a ball at you, I don't expect you to drop it and wait until it starts telling stories." I find this approach to be too clear-cut and reductionist in nature. Gameplay is almost always accompanied by a narrative as a means of engaging the player, and some games such as Until Dawn or Heavy Rain even center their games around a core narrative.
Until dawn, only your choices determine who will survive.
And I disagree with the idea that gameplay and narrative are separable at all in some cases. One interesting example of the bond between narrative and gameplay is Dark Souls, a series of games that are known to avoid pushing their game's narrative on the player. One can play the entire series and essentially ignore the narrative, as the only time it becomes an overt focus is in a handful of skippable cutscenes, and even in those instances the plot is kept as vague as possible. However, when examined deeper, a narrative begins to come clear from the periphery of the game, in things such as the item descriptions and, more importantly, non-player character behaviour. For example, in the first Dark Souls game, when you enter the New Londo ruins, you come across hollows, which are essentially the weakest enemy type in the game. However, these hollows are passive and won't attack the player unless attacked first. When studied in conjunction with the gameplay and the narrative setup, it becomes clear that these hollows are basically crazed survivors of a flood that befell New Londo, and as a simple passer through they have no reason to attack you, likely because they have nothing left to defend. This is just one example of gameplay being causally linked to and directly affecting narrative. Someone simply playing for the gameplay would take no notice of these developments across a story, but the fact remains that narrative carries a key role in the gameplay. Eskelinen himself even conceded later in his essay that when video games are studied, they're often colonized from the perspective of narrative theory, and are thusly seen as interactive forms of such narratives. For these reasons, I believe that the separation of ludology and narratology is an intrinsically flawed practice, as in most cases both are informed by the other. Gameplay informs narrative, and narrative informs gameplay. To me, this is what makes a conventional video game, the combination of gameplay and narrative to create an interesting and entertaining interactive experience.